The Jordan 4 RM Remix. Innovation or just a cheap, lazy way to make something seem like it's brand new? We're getting into that this time on Fire Footwear. Welcome back to Fire Footwear, everybody. As always, this is your host, Matt Frates. I hope that this finds you well. I want to thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode. And this week, we're going to talk about nostalgia a little bit. And we're going to do that by talking about the Jordan 4 RM, or the Jordan 4 Remix is supposedly what RM stands for. The Jordan 4, to me, is a classic model. I think it's one of the most popular Jordan models, if not sneaker models of all time. Obviously, it continues to be retro today. Obviously, there's been news of Jordan 4 colorways that we've never seen before, like the Undefeateds that are going to be re-released. This year specifically, I talked about the fact that OG colorways are kind of having a moment, whether they're reimagined or actually retros of an OG colorway. Jordan 4s are always going to be a part of sneaker culture, I think anyway, until maybe people who are like me and maybe a little bit older phase out of the game. And so Nike and Jordan Brand are staring at this period now where they're trying to figure out what to do about the future. And I think that Nike, I've said this before, may be panicking a little bit, or at least that's what I thought originally when they were going to be releasing the Undefeated 4s, when they're going to be releasing the Wu-Tang Dunks. But since then, we've heard of all of these different shoes, almost unobtainable shoes that people place on this pedestal that are going to be re-releasing in 2025. And I wondered to myself, why the urgency here? Is it the 40-year thing? What is it? Shattered backboards, PlayStation Air Force Ones, all these different things. I'm not really sure what Nike is thinking. And on the one hand, I can understand now having an opportunity to cop something that maybe you weren't in the culture for, maybe is too expensive or what have you. But I feel like, and Greg on Sneak Diss talked about this last week, I believe, or 2 weeks ago, about nostalgia and the loop that it creates, that we as sneaker people, and this is applicable to anything outside of sneakers as well, get caught up in this loop of nostalgia of always wanting to live in the past, so to speak. And I think sometimes the mentality of, well, it was better in my day can be a little bit dangerous, because while there are positive factors that accompany nostalgia in our minds, a lot of times when we move forward into the future, we move forward into a better place. And when I look at the place that sneaker culture may or may not be moving to, I get a little bit nervous. And that brings us to the Jordan 4 RM. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with this shoe or this model. I know that the marketing around it was a little bit strange at first, because when I saw Jordan 4, I thought, wait a minute, a new Jordan 4. And then when you see that Nigel Sylvester, who we're going to get into in a minute here, was associated with that first drop, you thought, ooh, a Nigel Sylvester Jordan 4. Now, Nigel, to his credit, is somebody who hasn't been pulled off the shelf all that much when it comes to collaborations, but when he has, they have been really, really great. There are really 4 collaborations that I think of since 2014 that relate to Nigel. There was the Nike SB Dunk High SOMP, which stood for Standing on My Pedals. Nigel Sylvester is a BMX rider. And so, of course, he's going to put a lot of those elements that are a big part in his life into the shoes, into the collaborations, and that made it known here. Black, metallic, silver. Honestly, it was a decent collaboration, but I think it was just sort of the tip of the iceberg. Fast forward to 2018, the Nigel Jordan 1, which I have to say, I have to make a confession here. I remember I was just getting back into sneakers at that point, and when I saw that, I didn't really understand what it was all about. I didn't really understand who Nigel Sylvester was. I didn't really understand why you'd want a shoe that would look like that. And now here we are 6 years later. And to me, that's one of my most slept on shoes ever. I'm not sure I could necessarily pull it off when it comes to fits, but the artistic vision, the story behind it, all of that really was executed super, super well. And it amazes me just how detailed all of that was. That was really a home run of a collaboration. And in my opinion, it really put kind of Nigel up there. Hadn't seen much from Nigel since then. I think it was in 2022 when he did an airship. Now, the Nike airship kind of has a weird place in sneaker culture because I think Nike was trying to rekindle the fire a little bit in terms of history, but people weren't really gravitating toward it. However, a lot of pictures resurfaced or surfaced on Instagram and on social media about this Nigel Sylvester airship that said Bike Air on it. Now, this exact collaboration didn't actually release, but I believe they released a version that was very, very similar with the same color palette, the same blocking, just didn't have the Bike Air on it. Wasn't really related to Nigel at all, but it was a fire shoe. You can actually get that, I think, for under retail now. We're very, very close too. But that really, I guess that wasn't an official Nigel collaboration, but it was close. And now we have coming or having released recently the Jordan 4 RM Grandma's Driveway. This was green. It had a black outsole and it had Bike Air and other nods to Nigel and so forth. And honestly, the marketing campaign was pretty genius when you saw the relationship he had with his grandmother and everything that they played up on it. It really worked well. And they had a press event or some kind of an event where Nigel was out in New York City. And man, so many people came to see this. And so Nigel is one of those people that I feel like they don't use him very often, but maybe that's a good thing because every time they do use him, it's great. There's a lot of hype. But when I look at this shoe and I look at Nigel's inclusion here, I think about the Jordan 4 and I think about history. Now, what is the RM? It's a reinterpretation of the Jordan 4, which is a classic. The RM version attempts to sort of bring some advances to the table and bring some advances to the game. And I think that both aesthetically and technologically, they're trying to accomplish that. It has a lower profile. You see the similar wings on the side. It doesn't have that heel tab that cuts into everybody's ankle. The cage is now on the heel of the shoe. It has a shorter tongue. So while it looks like a Jordan 4, it isn't a Jordan 4. To me, and this is not really shade, but it's the best way that I can describe this, is it looks like if you asked AI to create a more modern looking Jordan 4. If you typed into ChatGPT, please create a modern Jordan 4, that's, I think, what it would look like. Doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that that's what comes to mind. And so selecting Nigel to sort of debut this updated silhouette to sneaker culture was very smart because it's a name that people recognize now. I think that it looks kind of like an SB shoe, so to speak. So you could see somebody like Nigel actually wearing it. But the first colorway, the Grandma's Driveway, is just the tip of the iceberg. They're going to be releasing a whole assortment of colorways that they've already announced, like 15 colorways. And I think to myself, this shoe right here kind of represents where we are in the culture because we are really trying to figure out, and I mean we like this royal we brands, I guess mostly, but we as a culture are trying to figure out where we're going to go in the future because you have a lot of sneakerheads out there, especially on social media, doing a lot of talking about these old retros. Nothing wrong with a retro. There is nothing wrong with the black cement 3s. There's nothing wrong at all with the white cement 4s, shattered backboard 1s, you name it. All these retros, all these super hype shoes that a lot of people have very distinct memories about. And what worries me though is that the brand, I'm really talking about Nike here, doesn't really know how to move forward. Because right now we have this sort of dichotomy between sneaker culture. We have younger people, people in the middle, and then older people. And I think older people, or at least on the older end of things, are going to be more inclined to go backwards. That whenever we get into this cycle of retros of OGs or retros of super hype shoes, people are going to be really into it in that moment. But does it have a lasting effect? Like now, what do younger people look at the white cement for and think? That's what worries me. I'm not actually sure if they look at it and think that's something that I have to have. Now, maybe they have a friend or a family member or something like that who can help them and give them context to why the white cement 4 was so important, why the white cement 4 is so fire. But I think that Nike is missing an opportunity here. And I've heard this idea in other places, but I think that there is validity to this idea in somehow trying to merge new and old. So let's take the Jordan 4 RM, for example. Again, it's a fine looking shoe. There's nothing wrong with it. I think the green colorway works for a lot of people because it has the Nigel nods and everything. And there are some very serviceable colorways coming down the pipeline of this shoe. I could definitely see it as a beater, definitely see it as an everyday shoe. but it doesn't carry the weight that the Jordan 4 does. But I think Nike should have gone down the road and missed an opportunity of not having Nigel design both. Imagine if this was a pack. Imagine if a Jordan 4 that was designed by Nigel Sylvester, let's even say it was a Jordan 4 SB. Can you imagine a Nike SB that had Nigel Sylvester's stamp on it? That would have been absolute flames. And then you come out with this shoe. And the whole campaign sort of highlights this transition to a new era of the Jordan 4. You give people a reason as to why you're doing something. Give people a reason as to why you're changing the aesthetic, the nostalgic nods that you're putting on this new shoe. And I think even it's a misstep calling it a Jordan 4, because again, for a vast majority of the culture, the Jordan 4 comes to mind and you have a specific aesthetic in mind. You have a picture in your brain. And when you don't see that, the first comment is, that's not a Jordan 4. I'm not really sure who that's intended for. And I think that if you tried to merge these two things, you could actually take the old heads and the new heads, bring them together, and maybe we can try to find some common ground. You could do that with a lot of things now, but I think in this specific instance, with this remixed version of it, when you have them side by side, when you let the collaborator, the person that is bringing people to the store to buy this shoe, the person that is actually the inspiration for these shoes, why don't you give them an opportunity to tell a story historically and tell a story for the future? That's where I'm worried about. I feel like nostalgia is going to kill the culture in some way because there's a lot of people who are not willing to move forward, and there's a lot of people who are not willing to see why the history is important. And in this particular instance, we missed an opportunity as a culture to do both. Instead, a lot of the dialogue is, well, that's not a Jordan 4, that's no good, that's whack, that's not fire. Instead, because we're actually comparing it to the Jordan 4, nothing is comparable to the Jordan 4 the way that that shoe has a place in sneaker culture. I'm sorry. Maybe today it doesn't hold up for a lot of people, but in terms of history, and again, if you're going to move forward, you have to appreciate where you have been. The Jordan 4 had moments that were seen on television, in movies, on the court. It's an icon. The Jordan 4 RM, while maybe looking very similar to that shoe, is not that. And I'm not even sure if we'll see the Jordan 4 RM again after a year and a half, maybe 2 years. However, had they gone down the route of trying to give us a story, bring the old and the new together and make almost a transition to this new era of the Jordan 4, I think we would have seen a lot more people understanding it, and I think it would help to preserve the culture. It is what it is, though. We are now down this road where Nike and Jordan Brand have opened up the floodgates. Everything is in bounds, and it's different for them because of the historical connection that people have to their shoes. It would be like if one day they said, oh, here we go, Adidas is going to release every single Yeezy that's ever existed. Now, they just did a bunch of restocks because they actually had them handy. I'm talking about, oh, it's been 10 years since the Wave Runner. Let's just dump a whole bunch of them out. And people maybe won't appreciate it as much. And now I feel like we're just going to dump everything out. People are going to have copies of it. And it leads you to wonder what will have a place in history? What will actually stand the test of time? And I'm not sure we'll ever know that, because we're not ever going to marry the history and the future together. But before we get to the end of the episode, let's get to the release of the week. Release of the week, where I like to highlight a shoe that catches my eye. It's not always hype. Sometimes it is. It's just a shoe that I want you to know about. And I'm going to take this opportunity right now to shout out every single listener who is from the DMV. I live in the DMV. You all know this. I love the DMV. For those who are not familiar, the district, Maryland, Virginia, it is the Washington, D.C. area and the states that are sort of surrounding it, Northern Virginia, Southern Maryland. There's a lot to love here. And you know what? Sneaker culture has a place in the DMV, and it always has. And the Nike Foamposite is that shoe that sort of represents the DMV. And later on in August, you are going to get the DMV colorway of the Nike Foamposite 1, a very cherry blossom look, which unfortunately is sort of the cliched thing that designers go for when it comes to DMV or DC related shoes. But this is a nice looking shoe. I can tell you that a bunch of people that live in the DMV that are in our chat group on Instagram, they're going to be buying this shoe. maybe I can drive around DC and there'll be lines outside of stores for this shoe. I hope, because I would love it if the DMV got their own shoe and we showed out for it and balled out for it. But if you want that shoe, it releases in August. I believe it's August 17th. It's going to be $240, a steep price tag. But for those of us in the DMV who want a piece of history and who want to commemorate where we live and everything that it gives us, this is your time. So try to pick it up however you can. How do you feel about the Jordan 4 RM? And how do you feel about Nike's lack of an attempt to take history and the future and bring them together to find some common ground? I would love to know. Call the Fire Footwear voicemail line. That is area code 202-643-9170. And that is in the United States. So if you are out of the United States, make sure to use the appropriate country code. Leave me a voicemail, share a sneaker story, share an opinion. I would love to showcase them on a future episode coming up. Of course, if you want to find me on Instagram, you want to be a part of that group chat I talked about, at Fire Footwear Pod is the handle to do so. Follow me, send me a DM. I'd love to talk to you, add you to the group. If you want to see some other content that is aside from this podcast, you can go to TikTok, at Fire Footwear Pod is the handle. And of course, the YouTube channel, Fire Footwear, a sneaker podcast with Matty Ice, where I do a lot of videos that are an addendum to things that happen here. They're sort of supplemental. So it's new stuff. You're not going to get regurgitated material there. And of course, for all the audio listeners, I love all of you. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever it is that you listen, if you can give me a rating, give me a review, I would love that. Specifically on Apple Podcasts, it helps keep the show charting, which means it gets discovered. And the more people that discover it, the more content we can bring out and the bigger this thing gets. And I want this community to get as large as possible. Hope this finds everybody well, fam. I hope this finds everybody safe. And as always, I'll talk to you next time. This is Fire Footwear. The opinions and viewpoints expressed on Fire Footwear are those of Matt Frates and his guests, and not necessarily those of the Matty Ice Media Network. Fire Footwear is exclusively owned by Matt Frates and is brought to you by the Matty Ice Media Network.